I am Bob Pritchard, the Vice President of the Board of the Middlesex County Museum and Historical Society. And on behalf of Marilyn South, who is our president, and of other members of the board, I want to welcome you to this afternoon with best-selling author Brad Parks. Brad is a graduate of Dartmouth. He is a former reporter for the Washington Post and for the Newark, New Jersey Star-Ledger. Among his assignments, he sometimes followed sports. But in 2009, he left journalism for full-time writing, and since that time has written 11 novels. First, the 6 novels in the Carter Ross series, followed by a series of 5 standalone novels, of which the most recent is Unthinkable, that came out in 2021. He's also written 1 book of short stories. So we have, he's written many things. He's been translated into 16 languages and has been one of the few people, or the only person, to win the 3 major awards for fiction, crime fiction, the Shamus, the Nero, and the Lefty Awards. He has reached #1 in Amazon sales, and he lives locally in the Middle Peninsula with his wife and 2 school-aged children, and does some of his writing at the local Hardee's. So welcome, Brad. We're very pleased to have you here today. Brad is going to talk about his craft and his work for about 40 minutes. If you have a bright idea for a question in the midst of his conversation, you can find a chat function on the bottom of the screen. And if you write something and then hit return, it will show up. And we'll give you a chance. We'll save those questions when we go to questions at the end of his presentation. I'll read those in the case we have someone here without a chat function or on a telephone. And we'll have a chance also for questions made orally at that time. So I am going to mute myself. And Brad, thank you so much for sharing time with us.
Great to be here, and thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'd also like to thank, a few folks. I'd like to thank Marilyn, and also Besida Cawthorn White. Besida and I have the pleasure of serving on another board together, the Library of Virginia Foundation Board. And we have a good time there. I don't think the Library of Virginia Foundation, which, by the way, it tries to geographically spread itself out, realizes that it has 2 Middlesex County people hiding and making trouble on their board. But so that'll be like Besida and I's, little private, thing that we share. I need to acknowledge Greg and Kara Grichtmeyer, who I know are here and are watching, and they will actually become a part of this presentation during a dramatic reading later on. I'm just going to tease that for now. I'm just going to leave that there. So it's very fitting and appropriate, I feel like, to be making a presentation for the Middlesex County Museum and Historical Society, in as much as I live in Middlesex County and increasingly feel like I am very much a piece of history. This rapidly receding hairline, believe me, is being earned at every single turn. I am zooming to you today. I'm not going to pan my screen out because I've learned on Zoom that just never shows up that well, but I am zooming to you from the shore of the Rappahannock River, which I have come to grow to love so much during the, it's 14 years we've been living here in Middlesex County now. And so I won't show it to you, but I think most of you have seen it, so you can probably imagine. So the question I probably should start with, and this is whenever I have a local audience, I always know they're kind of looking at me, especially if they're not come here's, if they're born here's, they're always looking at me thinking, all right, you were not born here. How did you get here exactly? So I'm going to just head off that question right at the pass and kind of talk about my journey that led me to Middlesex and how this has really become my family's home. So unfortunately there's a little bit of a long answer of like, how did you get here, right? And it starts with the fact that, as Bob said, I'm a writer. I have always been a writer. I wrote my first novel when I was 7 years old. So, when people ask me, when did you become a writer? I think it's safe to say I was born as one. Bob mentioned I used to like to cover sports. I had this very large internal world as a kid where I would actually imagine myself as the sports hero, and I would tell myself the story of what the football player or baseball player or tennis player or whatever was in season was going through, and I would create the stories in my head. So it was probably very fitting that by the time I was 14, I was earning my first paycheck as a writer. I started writing sports for my hometown paper in Connecticut, kind of the equivalent of the Southside Sentinel. Except it was called the Ridgefield Press in Ridgefield, Connecticut. I discovered very early on something about myself that remains very much true today. There are people writers, who they write for a lot of different reasons, right? A lot of them write for themselves. They write as a form of therapy. They're trying to figure things out. I've really only written ever for one reason, and that's for you, for the reader. What I discovered and what really turned me on about writing and about being a journalist when I was starting out was not the writing. The writing is hard, frankly. It's still hard. All these years later, I've been doing it. It's the being read. I loved being read. And even though I was not much of a writer at the beginning, believe me, I could, I would have these sentences like, the Darien High School girls basketball team were like guppies visiting a shark tank when they came to Ridgefield on Friday. Just like awful stuff. But then, the dads whose daughters were on the team and they would read it in the paper. And then, the next day they'd see me and be like, hey, Brad, guppies in a shark tank. Good stuff, man. And as a teenager who you think the world pretty much evolves around you, it's like, oh my God, I have a readership. But then also as time went along, I started realizing that stories were important and stories that mattered. And that really what I was doing was I was moving people with words. And you can move them to laughter, and you can move them to tears. You can move them to, face plant. You can, move them to, in some of these books, not want to put the book down, hopefully late at night as they're reading well past their bedtime. That kind of remains my goal even now. And I just felt like the medium, and I know Basaida suggested I might be a good stand-up comic. And the fact is, Basaida, no, I wouldn't, because here's the real key about being a writer. If you're a stand-up comic and someone heckles you, you have to come up with your retort immediately, right? And I'm a writer, which means I will come up with the perfect, absolutely blistering, withering retort anywhere from 5 minutes to 5 days to 5 months after I have been heckled. And that is probably not going to work out very well for stand-up comedy. But it does work out for writing because you do have that time. And if anything, I think I've learned I am persistent more than anything with writing because, there's no stopwatch on writing. There's nobody who can tell you when to stop. There's nobody who can say, nope, you're done now. No, you get to sit down and keep banging your head against the laptop screen as long as you want until you get it to turn out right. So anyway, I've already interrupted my story into how exactly a guy who talks like me and was born in New Jersey and raised in Connecticut winds up in Middlesex County, Virginia. So fast forward, I wrote all through high school. I wrote all through college. I actually founded my own sports newspaper at Dartmouth College. As a matter of fact, wait, there it is. Hold it. There it is right there. That is the first ever issue of the Sports Weekly. Yeah, it was a weekly sports newspaper. I called it The Sports Weekly. I've always been very good at titles. And after college, so during college, I was an intern at the Boston Globe. That led to an internship at the Washington Post. That led to a job at the Washington Post because, believe it or not, newspapers back then were still hiring. I now have to explain to my children who are in their teens, like what newspapers are and how important they once were and whatnot, much to the same way that my dad, who was a typewriter salesman, had to explain to me what typewriters were once upon a time. So we've always been very forward-thinking, us Parks men. Anyhow, so I left the Washington Post after a few years because I realized I was never going to, I was waiting around for somebody to die or retire at that kind of paper, of course. And I moved to the New York Star Ledger, a slightly smaller, though very prestigious newspaper in New Jersey, and they let me do everything. I covered all the major sports, Super Bowl, Masters, World Series, you name it. I then switched over to news side, and once again, I covered 9/11, I covered Hurricane Katrina, I covered everything that I could have possibly wanted to, and really came to see humanity in a very real and very different way. I always say that there's no education quite like being a newspaper reporter, because you are constantly being thrust out into the world with really one job, and that is figure out what happened here and then tell a story. And that is a remarkable muscle to be able to work, and you learn a lot along the way, because to figure out what happened here, you have to talk to a lot of different people and a lot of different kinds of people, and you have to talk to them in different ways, and you need to I think drill down and get beneath maybe sometimes what is the soundbite they want to give me. And you say, and oh, by the way, I still as a guy, even though I've been a novelist for a long time, I still organize my life based on reporter's pads. Like I need a reporter's pad in my head to think. So it's like, all right, you've given me your soundbite, now let's get down to, the real guts of the matter. And I did that for years, and I loved it. And there was nothing, people will sometimes assume that as a journalist turned novelist, that it was the demands of Deadline that must have drove me away. But actually, no, I loved Deadline. I was a Deadline junkie, man. Like, you tell me you've got 20 minutes, everything has just changed, jam it out. And by the way, and this was actually a nice little chat I had one time with my sports editor right before he sent me out to cover a Yankees game. He explained to me that they would be holding that day's edition of the paper, because every large paper has different editions that go to different counties and whatnot. They would be holding an edition on the Yankees result, and they could not print the paper until I hit the button and sent my story with the Yankees result. And furthermore, he explained to me that for every minute they had to wait, it cost the newspaper $15,000 in press people, in trucks, in gas, in overtime, in you name it. And he said, $15,000 a minute. And how much are you making a year, young man? It's like, okay, I understand what's going on here. So I very much loved it. And I got to do some wonderful work and meet some great people. But this funny thing was happening. And that is, as my career was kind of going like this, the newspaper business was going like this. And the paper I was at had a hiring freeze as of 2004. It had a wage freeze as of 2004. And mind you, if you'll remember, this is the Historical Society, so we do like to think back. The economy was actually doing great back then, right? And yet we were suddenly sliding slowly into the tank. And I'll always remember, because it leads directly. Yeah, I'm going to get around to how did I get to Middlesex County soon, I promise. This leads directly to why we ended up here. So it was the end of 2007. I had been doing what I considered to be, some of the best work at the paper. I'd written a series about the 40th anniversary of the Newark riots that, got some attention for Pulitzer consideration and won a very nice prize in New Jersey and whatnot. And so at the end of the year, I went to my boss and I said, look, I haven't had a raise in 3 years. We've just had a baby. I know you can't afford to give everybody raises anymore, but could you give me $50 more a week? Things have gotten more expensive for me. And he said, I'd love to, but I can't. And that was when I knew that this thing that I loved was not going to last, and that I needed to find something else to do with my life. So my wife had at one point worked at a boarding school, and we had actually not lived on the campus of the boarding school, but we knew from that experience that the deal with a boarding school was you can work at the boarding school and live on campus rent-free. And if I was about to reinvent myself as a novelist, rent-free would be about what I could afford. So my wife started looking for a job, and I said, honey, wherever you get a job, whatever place you like best, that's where we're going to go. And she really took a shine to this small private school in Middlesex County, Virginia, called Christ Church School. And she interviewed there, and they really liked her, and she really liked them. So now they're bringing me in, right? They're trying to kind of close the deal. And I still have this vivid memory of the first time I drove past the Middlesex County sign, and the first time, I don't think I had ever laid eyes on a Hardee's restaurant before, but I can remember making that turn off of 17 that we've all made 1,000 times onto 33 at the Hardee's and seeing that Hardee's restaurant. And had I known how my life was going to turn out, I would have stopped right there and just introduced myself to everybody inside and saved myself a lot of trouble. But we went to the school. We both very much loved it. And actually, while we were there, they said, oh, by the way, this is where we think you're going to live when you come on campus. And they took us off down this kind of dark road and down another dirt road. And again, I mean, we're from New Jersey. Like this is like, you can't drive a block and a half without a stoplight. And suddenly it's like, I'm hearing the banjos playing as we're going down this dirt road. And then they take us to this place that I'm actually looking out at right now. It is this beautiful, beautiful patch of land right on the Rappahannock River, gently sloping down into the river with a white sand beach as its backyard. And I thought I had been taken to heaven. And I couldn't figure out why was it that they were going to let us newcomers be staying in this little tiny cottage that was sitting kind of up on top of the hill at this place. That's because I hadn't spent a winter in that cottage yet. So my wife accepted the job and we came down here, and sure enough, there we were put into this classic Middlesex County 1950s summer cottage. It had the cinder block. God, I have no nouns today. See, this is what being Middlesex County history means. Like you start losing your nouns. Cinder block foundation, that's what I'm looking for. And also no insulation whatsoever. This was the kind of place where, those days in December when suddenly the wind is coming barreling in off the north from the Rappahannock River. I could tell you which way the wind was blowing when we were in this cottage. But nevertheless, here we were in this little place, and here I was starting this career. So my first 6 books, as Bob said, were very much, I hate to call them romaniclefs, but that's sort of what they were. They were an investigative newspaper reporter who writes about crime in Newark, New Jersey, which was, of course, all things I knew very well because I had walked those paths. I had lived that life. I had actually written the first book before we came down to Middlesex County. And it was after my wife had agreed to take the job at Christ Church School, and we sold our house in New Jersey. And all right, we're making this move. It was literally 2 weeks before the moving vans arrived when I got the call from my agent saying, oh, remember that investigative newspaper reporter book you sold? Yeah, sure. She said, I just sold it to St. Martin's Press. It's a 2-book contract. Congratulations, you're going to be an author. So here I was, I was quitting my job as a journalist to go be an author. And I was an author. Bam, done already. It made us, look like we knew what we were doing, essentially. But so that was a wonderful start. And for 6 books, Carter Ross and I had many adventures. But the funny thing is, they were all set in New Jersey. And they were all this kind of happy-go-lucky single guy having these adventures. And I suddenly was not in New Jersey anymore. And I was not a happy-go-lucky single guy. I was a very happy married guy with 2 little kids. And I found myself kind of getting away from the feel of what it was to be in Newark, New Jersey. And because everything around me I was seeing was, life in this rural county, this place where, okay, so by this, I should have already introduced Hardee's as a character for this talk. The reason why Hardee's became so very, very important in my life is that we have 2 small children at this point when we've made this move. And suddenly we are in this 1,200 square foot summer cottage. And there's no writing that's going to get done while these children are in this summer cottage. So the first summer that we were, so my wife had worked a full year at Christ Church School, and all of a sudden it's summer. So we don't have childcare anymore. There's no little daycare or anything like that. And the kids are just home with us. So my wife kind of was working part-time as an administrator, and I was working as well, but I was not going to be able to get writing done. So as you all well know, the only place that is open at 6 o'clock in the morning when I kind of wake up and naturally start my day is the Hardee's. So that's where I went off to. And what I discovered very quickly, and this has changed, of course, but this is back in the day, historical people, you'll remember this. Hardee's did not have wireless internet. And for me, wireless internet is the greatest distraction ever devised for humankind. And so here suddenly was this little sanctuary that I went to. There was no internet, and I was only there for one reason. I was there to write. I wasn't there to like, oh, there's no doing the laundry, there's no doing the dishes, there's no fixing the leaky sink, no, I am there to write. And that first summer, actually, I was there to write for a specific number of hours because then my wife had to go off to work herself and I had to watch the kids. And it really just became this great rhythm that I got into when like suddenly, man, you only have a little bit of time. And your time is suddenly made very precious. And I just would go to Hardee's and I would get into it. I met a lot of course, wonderful Middlesex County residents at Hardee's, many of whom are still my friends. I will not out this person, but I can remember as I sat down there and I was doing my writing and I'm starting to get to know people. And I have this accent that is clearly not from here. And sitting down with a gentleman who explained to me that he said, son, the population of Middlesex County in 1930 was 10,000 people. It's still 10,000 people, and we aim to keep it that way. So it's like, okay, I know what I'm getting into here. But of course, Hardee's ended up becoming a wonderful, wonderful place for me to write. I made a lot of friends there, some of whom really, by the way, had my back in very important ways. So when I write, there's a lot going on in my head, and I can always like close my eyes and I can see the character and I can hear them talk. Like they're real people to me, right? And but sometimes if I get stuck, I kind of have to. I can't be sitting at my laptop anymore. I need to get up. I need to move, right? And then the characters kind of need to start talking to me. And sometimes if I'm not being real careful, I start talking out loud. I start saying the things they're going to say. And often the place I would do this would be pacing around the Hardee's parking lot, right? And any of my fellow writers will recognize that this is kind of very normal behavior for a writer. The Virginia State Police do not recognize this as normal behavior. So there was, in fact, one day when a state trooper pulled up, and by the way, when I go to Hardee's, I was like, I never shaved. I was always kind of wearing this rumpled like zip up jacket. I'm sure I looked pretty much like a vagrant. And so the state trooper pulls up and he says to the drive-through, he says, ma'am, there's a deranged man walking around your parking lot right now. Do you want me to pick him up for you? And thank God I knew all the staff there because she said, no, it's okay. That's just our author. As if every Hardee's has an author, right? So anyhow, so I, had many, many wonderful years at Hardee's and a lot of good time writing. But like I said, I was starting to get more and more distant from this New Jersey character that I had been writing. And it was also good for my career to kind of branch out beyond the series. And I wanted to write something that was a little closer to home. And I spent a long time figuring out what this book would be. Kind of your first standalone novel after 6 books in a series, needs to make a statement. It needs to really be something special. And I actually spent a whole summer brainstorming ideas, all of which were terrible. I always say I get 10 ideas for a book a week and 11 of them are bad. And this was, in fact, a really, really bad summer of really, really bad ideas. But there was one day when I had just discarded my latest horrible idea. It had, collapsed under the weight of its preposterousness. And I gave up and I went out for a run. Now, for whatever reason, I do my best thinking while I'm running. And so I was running down toward Best Boatyard. Sorry, it's now the Boatyard at Christ Church, another historical reference for you guys. And I was just kind of rounding the curve there. And I was thinking about some advice that a friend of mine had actually given me. Steve Hamilton is his name. And he said, you have to write the book that scares you, right? And I thought, well, what scares me? Well, maybe something happening to my kids. Like, what if they were kidnapped, right? And then I was thinking, but, why would anybody want to kidnap my children? Heck, I barely want them sometimes. I'm kidding, kids. Daddy's just kidding, okay? But nevertheless, like you need to have something plausible, and it can't just be ransom. Like money is not that interesting. So, but who would be a character that would maybe have something else to offer that the kidnappers would want to take their children for? And so I can still see the spot. I'm rounding that corner, heading straight toward Best Boatyard, when I think, a judge. Wait a second, a judge who's this very upright guy. You can't bribe him, you can't get to him, you can't pressure him in any way. But if you have your children, he'll give you the verdict you want. And so that became Say Nothing, which that was the premise, a federal judge whose children were kidnapped by somebody looking to control the outcome of a case he's hearing. And Say Nothing really kind of changed the trajectory of my career. The other thing that was changing around this time was we were still living in that little cottage that I had talked about that was, falling apart. Let's be very clear. And so I actually, and this is actually never something I've talked about really at a public show, but what the heck, you guys are neighbors. So I actually approached the headmaster, recently retired, Jeb Byers at Christ Church School, and I said, hey, look, we've got this beautiful, beautiful spot on the water with this awful house on it. Do you think we could knock down the house and build something on that piece of property? And the school won't have to pay for it. We'll pay for the house, and if we ever leave, the school can just buy the house from us, right? We'll do some kind of land rent deal, whatever. And Jeb took this up the flagpole, and what came back from the board was, no, we're actually not interested in that, but would you like to buy the property? Which, for those of you who know Middlesex County, there's a reason why certain pieces of land never come on the market. And this was another example, right? So immediately we snatched it up. And I'll get back to the property in a moment. But anyhow, so Say Nothing comes out. Like I said, it really kind of changed my career. And it also got me into writing standalones. My next standalone was called Closer Than You Know. It is set in Stanton, Virginia, actually. I probably shouldn't talk about this too much in Middlesex County, but we did have 2 years out in Stanton, Virginia. We became big fans of Montessori schools, and we were sending our children to the Northern Neck Montessori School. Unfortunately, they aged out of the Northern Neck Montessori School, and so we had to find another Montessori school, and somehow we ended up moving to Stanton. Long story. Anyway, we came back because, frankly, we loved it here. Stanton was very nice too, but by this point, this was the place where I brought my daughter home here from the hospital. It had really become home. Melissa really loved working at Christ Church School and kind of the soul of the place. I loved the river, and I swim in the river. Unless there are jellyfish, I swim in the river, probably 8 months a year. I go for long swims. So back we came here. I wrote another book. It was called The Last Act. This is about an out-of-work actor who is hired by the FBI to help them bring down a ruthless Mexican drug cartel by infiltrating a federal prison and pretending to be an inmate there and getting information. So if you like that premise, so did the people at, See, I'm losing I've forgotten the name of the production company that has optioned that book to hopefully turn it into a TV series. But it has been optioned. It is in development by Dreamscape. I might have that wrong. See, this is why I write books. When you're writing books and you forget something, you can just look it up. It's fine. So that was that book. The next book was called Interference. This takes a little turn into quantum physics, but don't be too scared. I was not a great science student. If I understand the physics, you can understand the physics too. And that brings me to my latest book, which is Unthinkable, is what it's called. And this is where we get to meet the Grichtmeyers. So a little bit of background and setting. So this book is, where it really comes from is I had learned by this point, this is my 11th book, so you learn a few things along the way. And I had learned that what really makes a book go is what we in the business call stakes, right? Like what's at stake? What is potentially being won and lost? If the character fails, what's going to happen to them? And the answer to that question needs to be something fairly profound. and that these are the books that really keep you reading late at night. The book that you can easily put down is that book where it's like, well, the character is trying to solve the murder because it happened in their cheese shop. And if they can't solve the murder, then they won't know who killed somebody in their cheese shop. But then, the first question is always, well, why don't you just call the police? And secondly, so you don't solve the murder, you still get your cheese shop. Anyhow. I want to have books where the stakes and what's up for grab are really monumental. So I started this book with stakes. And, again, I always think of what's the worst thing that you could ask someone to do? And the first thing that popped into my head, right? And I don't know why, and I assure you, I have a very, very happy marriage. But the first thing that popped into my head was, gosh, what if somebody asked me to kill my wife? And what if there was some very, very credible reason why I had to kill my wife? And what would I do? And let's be very clear. I do have a happy marriage, because if I didn't have a very happy marriage, and this is as I was kind of thinking about this character, because, by this point, I'm not writing these books about me anymore. I kind of moved on from this. I really am kind of coming up with these characters. And I realized very early on, you can't make this a troubled marriage, because everybody who's ever been in a troubled marriage will then go, oh yeah, I know how this is going to end. He's just going to kill his wife because, hey, we've all wanted to kill our spouse sometimes, right? But no. This has to be a really, really very happy marriage. So what it comes down to, and I don't want to ruin too much of the plot, but the man is told he has to kill his wife or 1 billion people will die, right? And that is actually also a premise that made some screenwriters very happy. This one has been optioned by MGM Television, and they are also now hopefully in production. By the way, when you hear something has been optioned, don't get excited yet. And also, if any of you represent the Middlesex County Tax Board, don't jack up my valuation of my house just yet, because what optioned means is I've gotten a little bit of money, but not a lot of money. So don't get too excited. I'm still driving a Ford to the Food Lion, everyone. All right, so let's put this all very much in perspective. But nevertheless, so that was the premise of Unthinkable. But I also had this challenge in that. And I can't remember, Kara and Greg, what year it was. It was either 2018 or 2019. I emceed, along with Mark Favazza, the Middlesex County Mardi Gras, the fundraising event for the Boys and Girls Club and the YMCA. And I auctioned off a character name in a future Brad Parks novel. And the winners of that were Kara and Greg Grichtmeyer. So here I suddenly have these very nice people who are going to have to become characters. And I'm describing, of course, so the married couple, Nate and Jenny is what their names are, Nate is told he needs to kill his wife and what's going on, but he loves her and everything like that. And then we do enter the Grichtmeyers. The Grichtmeyers are good, close personal friends of Nate and Jenny. And I described Kara Grichtmeyer as being, and this is so you know, any of you who ever get a chance to bid on a character at an auction for me ever again, this is maybe sometimes how you'll get described. In addition to being smart, kind, and randomly irreverent, Kara was quite inconveniently a knockout. Shimmering hair, flawless skin, nicely toned legs. Inconvenient, of course, because Nate is married happily to Jenny, right? So then I get around to describing Greg Grichtmeyer. Greg Grichtmeyer turned out to be every bit as attractive as his wife. He was this big guy with a chiseled jaw and the kind of thick, wavy hair that belonged on a politician or a TV weatherman. He was also gregarious, charismatic, and of all things, an accountant. And again, I don't want to give away too much plot here, but it turns out that Greg Grichtmeyer may be having an affair with a woman not his wife in this novel. Hopefully that makes you all want to know what that scoundrel Greg Grichtmeyer has been up to, and I have hopefully destroyed his reputation entirely. We'll see. So this, we are kind of wrapping up the end of, obviously how I've how I've gotten to Middlesex County. But then we get to how I've stayed here. And this is actually what we did over the pandemic. And that is, it became very clear that our future was, in fact, in Middlesex County, and that my children would be attending Christ Church School, where my wife still happily works. And we still had this falling down, rotting cottage with bad wiring and really scary plumbing. And we looked into various options for, could we renovate it? Could we expand it? Could we do so? Oh, the other thing about this cottage is it only had one bathroom. And that's cute when you have toddlers. When you have teenagers, that is impossible. So we started looking at various options, and we finally decided to knock the cottage down and build something. And so it's another thing it just feels personally very satisfying that that's what we've done. We've having bought this property, we've now built a lovely, nice little 4-bedroom house for our nice little family, and have really made Middlesex County home. We have put in deep, hard roots. My children know of no other place, and they've had this kind of special, magical childhood where they've gotten to go down to the Rappahannock River and play in the mud. They've gotten to grow up at the boarding school of the campus at Christ Church School. I, for one, have when we first came down here, I think it was a culture shock in many ways. At least one of them was that where we lived in New Jersey, we probably had about 4 major shopping malls within about a 25-minute drive. And now we have 2 Walmarts within a 25-minute drive, right? And that was a little bit shocking at first, but I've really come to love it, frankly, that we can, pull out of the exit to Christ Church School at Friday afternoon at 5:00 and not see another car on Route 33, right? And I love the slower pace of life here. We love the friends we've made here. Unfortunately, I have not been going to Hardee's lately. The pandemic has kind of really knocked that out, and I kind of keep waiting for the moment when it feels safe to return. I think initially I was really worried about, because I know a lot of the folks who work at Hardee's, of course, and I just worried that, if I somehow had this thing and didn't know it, because by the way, I spend 4 hours a day typically writing. And so I used to spend 4 hours a day in Hardee's. And if I was sitting there in the Hardee's for 4 hours in that corner table that I love so much, spewing out virus, I would wipe out the entire breakfast shift. And I just didn't need that on my conscience. So I have not been back to Hardee's, although I do maybe, hopefully, as we all look forward to our achingly slow return to normal, I look forward someday to being able to go back to Hardee's. And in the meantime, I continue to write books. Everybody always asks me when I finish up one book, they say, "Oh, what's next?" As if I'm going to say, "Well, now I'm going to master the cello." No, I'm going to write another book. I'm always writing another book. I also do ghostwriting because I have come to realize that I am faster with my fingers than a lot of writers. But most publishing companies, unless your name is James Patterson, they only want 1 book a year from you. And I'm capable of writing more than 1 book a year. So typically I will write a book a year for myself and a book a year for somebody else, which is a great way to pay the bills for sure. I always say my name does not go on the book, but it does go on the check, which is very important. But I love continuing to tell stories, and in some ways to bring this all around to where we started. I'm still trying to do the thing that I started trying to do when I was 14 years old. I'm trying to entertain you. I'm trying to make you feel things when I write, and I'm trying to move you to being scared, to being thrilled, to laughing, to whatever it is. And for as much as I do this job, let's be realistic. It is a job. I'm unfortunately not independently wealthy, so I do need to support my family doing this. But so beyond that, of why do I do this? The main reason is still that same thing. I write to be read. There is still nothing more satisfying to me than when I get an email from a reader saying, whatever it is they've connected to about the book. Because what I've come to realize is that these are, this is a very, I couldn't say very unique, because then you grammar grouches out there would say there's no such thing as very unique. So I will just say this is a unique form of media, in that when you watch a TV show or a movie or whatever else, even reading a newspaper for that matter, what you're getting is multiple people's visions, right? The screenwriter has one idea, and then the director takes it and does something else with it, and then the actor might interpret the line in a certain different way. Oh, and by the way, 3/4 of it ends up on the cutting room floor anyway. So you're kind of getting all these fingers in the pie of the entertainment product. Not with this. This is basically it's all me, and there's some confusion about that of like, does your editor, like my editor never actually lays hands on the actual manuscript. Everything that appeared in this book was once on my computer screen in a Microsoft Word document, right? And what creates it is everything that I've ever experienced in my life, right? Everybody I've ever met, every thought I've ever had, everything I've ever seen, like it's all grist for the mill. Like I always joke with friends and family, look, if you don't want to see it in a book someday, there's one really safe way, and that is don't tell me. Okay. Otherwise, if you tell me, it's fair game and it might end up in a book. But so after I've done that though, right? After it's like, again, all of my experiences and all of my thoughts and everything I've read and whatnot, and I pour it into this novel, but then the novel only comes alive in one place. And that is the mind of the person who's reading it. Right. And just as I'm bringing everything I've ever experienced to the writing of it, they're bringing everything they've ever experienced to the reading of it. They actually might see layers to the book that I didn't see myself. Right. Or I'm writing about I'm thinking of, the house I lived in the 3rd grade in Delaware, and they're seeing their aunt's house when they were growing up. Right. And, so we are sort of creating that entertainment product together, essentially, because it's all my stuff and then it's all their stuff. So when they write to me and say, oh, you had this character in here, did you know my friend Nancy? Because it sounds like exactly you've described my friend Nancy, and at that point, I know I've done what I set out to do, which is to touch people with words, to reach them, to make my story in some small way a part of their life. And sometimes you get like these absolutely mind-blowing stories of like, I will never forget, I got a nice email from a woman who said that, unfortunately her father was passing away, and he was a big fan of mine and really liked my books. And so they took turns reading my books to him as he was kind of passing in and out of consciousness, which is like, I get kind of choked up as I even think about it. And apparently they were reading him one part, and they thought he was, mostly out of it and not paying attention. And then he kind of like perked up for a second. He said, "You can skip this part. I know it's not the secretary." So you get that stuff too, right? Just that wonderful, again, that human interaction that is what we are all, I think, striving for in this world. So I have yammered at you for exactly 40 minutes. And at this point, I would love to, and libeled Greg Grickmeyer along the way. So, hey, that's a good day for me. But I would love to open it up to any questions you have. I have not been monitoring the chat, so just, pop in.
Brad, just a couple of questions. You did get 2 responses on the chat from Greg and Cara. So wrong and not sure either. I want to expand on that, but I'll give them a chance in a minute. But you also got a question about schedule from Janet Farrell. Ray, time management. Do you hold to a schedule so that you're focused on writing for about the same amount of time every day? Is it even possible to have a timeline for submission, editing, completion?
Right. So we should never talk about religion in mixed company, but I will, because the church I go to when it comes to writing is what I call the church of 1,000 words. And that is, with religious fervency, I write 1,000 words a day. Period. End of story. No excuses, no exceptions. That's what I do. And if you write 1,000 words a day, actually all of the timeline stuff and all the deadline stuff really doesn't become that much of a problem. because you can do the math. I typically work 6 days a week. And if anything, I probably, like 1,000 is a minimum. I'll end up writing maybe a little more than that, 1,200, 1,400, 1,800 if I really get rolling. But if you do that, you will have a rough draft of a book written in 3 months. And so that kind of really keeps you well ahead of the pace. I should preface that by saying every writer is different, and this is my process. I do not recommend it for everyone. I am a little bit of a maniac, and I am a former journalist, and we certainly do know how to crank out copy. But that is really my discipline, and it's a scary thing, because the question of like, so what happens to me in a given day if I don't write my 1,000 words? Well, the answer is nothing, frankly. Like, no one's going to call me. No one's going to complain. No one's even going to know, right? But then, like, well, what happens if I don't ever write my 1,000 words? And it's the same thing, nothing. Like, books will not get done. I will not get paid. I will not be able to, pay my mortgage. And so it tends to really keep me motivated. That and a nice, firm, hard sense of self-loathing, which I recommend highly, which is like, if you can't do your 1,000 words a day, you just you hate yourself so much that you just have to. It's not even an option. But that's kind of how I keep going. Did that answer your question? Nope. Bob, you're muted.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful.
I get fooled sometimes and try to unmute on the wrong spot. But so Janet, sounds like that answered the question. We also had Barbara Lovelace noticed.
Hi, Barbara.
That she, unthinkable kept me up exceedingly late 3 nights. So you got what you were hoping for. A page turner. I want to ask just one question,
Sure.
and that is about research. When you wrote about people in Newark, you were able to draw on your own background, but when you began talking about judges and attorneys and other things, what do you do to acquaint yourself to the subject matter?
Sure. Well, you have to know the world, right? And that was the beautiful thing about those 6 books in Newark. I knew the world already, right? But so yeah, suddenly I'm writing a book about a federal judge, right? What do I know? I mean, now I have a few advantages, Bob, in that when you're a newspaper reporter, you tend to get your fingers in a lot of things. Very broadly, not very deeply, mind you, but you kind of know a little bit about lots, right? So I had certainly been in courtrooms, never in federal court, but I'd done a lot of, covering trials. I had covered divorce trials. I'd covered murder trials. I had covered all sorts of things, right? So I kind of knew roughly how the law worked. But federal court is a different animal, of course. So I would drive down to Norfolk, the Eastern District of Virginia, this beautiful courthouse, and I would hang out in the courthouse and watch what was going on. And just, wherever there happened to be a trial going on that day or a hearing going on that day, it's great entertainment. I mean, it's all for free, right? You just get to walk in and sit down, good seats still available. Now, in this case with the judge, there was a little bit of an extra challenge with the judge aspect of it, of course, because federal judges are not very talkative by nature. They prefer to speak through their rulings and nothing else, because a lot of what I like to do is if I'm suddenly writing about a soldier, say, it's like, well, okay, I'll go and read 4 or 5 soldiers' memoirs, right? So I can get a sense for the language and the thought process and who they are. And then maybe if I have a friend I know who served in the military, I'll call them up and say, hey, tell me about this or whatnot. But you don't. Judges don't write memoirs, and they are not featured in glossy magazines like At Home with Judge and so. You don't get that stuff. So I actually found a judge in the Eastern District of Virginia to whom I promised total anonymity in exchange for letting me shadow that judge. And so I went to that judge's courtroom. I went into that judge's chambers. I talked with that judge. I really kind of got to know that judge. And actually, it really, I wouldn't be able to pull up the exact passage, but there are definitely some moments that, you know, in this book where the things I was having my judge think and say were very much things that that judge had thought and said. You know, like, for example, there's a part in that book that deals with what is called a routine drug sentencing, right? Except if you are now the one doing the sentencing, there's nothing routine about it. Every federal judge, before they sentence someone, is given a probation report. And the probation report, you learn, is like that, the defendant's life story, basically. And that is where you learn that, okay, this person who you think is just the typical drug, whatever, you know, because by the way, drug sentencings are like the most prevalent action that happen in federal court, right? That is like, if you had to say there's one thing that happens more than any other, drug sentencing, that's it. But suddenly you're learning that this person you're going to sentence is, well, they were actually abandoned by their mother and raised by their aunt who then died, and then bounced around between 6 different foster homes. And, you know, and suddenly it becomes, this is a human being that you're sentencing. And furthermore, if you've been to federal prison, and I have, not that way, they're not nice places. They really just are pretty inhumane. And, you know, nobody wants to hear much about, you know, prison reform or criminal justice reform. And they like it being out of sight, out of mind. But dang, if you've ever been to one, I mean, these are rough places. And when suddenly it is you and you alone who is deciding how many years of this person's life should they spend, right? And what debt do they owe to society? Because, oh, by the way, another thing that the federal judge sometimes has is at the sentencing hearing, you know, they get to hear from the victims of like, you know, I sat in on a drug sentencing, and I use this in my book, that was this drug dealer that a kid had overdosed on this drug dealer's product. And so there is this guy's, this poor child's father standing up and talking about how painful it was to lose a child to this. You know, so as the judge, suddenly this is all on you as a judge, right? And federal judges do not, first of all, they serve for life, and they really pretty much answer to no one. And yeah, there are guidelines, but they can do whatever they want really within the guidelines. And it's not really realistically going to get overturned. So, I mean, it's an incredible amount of pressure. And you realize that these folks who you think, well, they're just rubber stamping this stuff and moving on. No, actually, at least the judge I hung out with put a lot of thought and time and care into it, right? So that's just, you know, one example of you know, research. So I always kind of need to know, like, this book is set, Closer Than You Know, is set in the actually in the child protective world in the foster care system. So, you know, I went to children and youth and family court. What do we call it here? Juvenile and family, you know, family court. You guys know what it is. And hung around there. I talked to some folks who are in that world in Middlesex County, actually, to, you know, kind of get their perspective on things and talk, you know, enough to basically, the research is so that I can credibly represent the world. And I feel like I get this world. For this book, this is the one set in a federal prison. I actually went to a federal prison. Mind you, this was a white collar crime, so nonviolent. So it was a minimum security federal prison. But I, sure enough, went to the Federal Corrections institution, whatever. Again, I'm losing my words, in Morgantown, West Virginia. And I got a tour there and hung out there, and ended up actually the best thing I did later on that day was, after I'd gotten my tour, I found the bar that all the corrections officers hung out at, and I basically started buying them drinks and getting stories out of them. You know, so you would hear stories about, like, I'm like, all right, what's the weirdest place that you've ever had an inmate try to hide something in order to bring contraband into the prison? And I mean, this is almost too gross for words, but like, this guy told me about how this one inmate actually hollowed out a callus in his foot and was using it as like a little pouch, and was stuffing marijuana cigarettes into the pouch in his hollowed out callus in his foot. And so when he was being strip searched, he was just standing there on his marijuana cigarettes, grinning like a Cheshire cat, knowing that he was never going to get caught. You know, that's the kind of thing that you only get if you go out and do the research. And that's the wonderful thing about the journalism background is you learn how to ask people questions, and you learn how that truth is always stranger than fiction.
Thank you. if there are others who have some questions, you can unmute yourself and address them to our speaker.
I have a question. How do you edit yourself?
So editing, so typically what I do is I don't really share it with the manuscript with anyone while I'm writing it, because frankly, I don't know how it ends. And a lot of stuff therefore is going to change in the beginning. So I think I'll just make it way too confusing for anybody. But when I reach the end, I then do what I call the elephants dangling from the ceiling edit, which is you go back through the book and make sure you didn't leave any elephants dangling from the ceiling. And if you do, get the poor elephants down, right? So that's just a basic, you want to kind of, make sure everything's consistent, make sure you didn't call them, Greg Grichtmeyer on page 33, but then call them Bob Pritchard on page 77. Yeah, that sort of thing. So then once I'm done that, I send it off to beta readers, as we call them. These are people who have, read all of my work, who know all of my work, and who will then comment on it. And, they kind of know that everything is fair game. I typically ask them two questions. One, did you understand everything? Were you confused anywhere? I don't want anybody confused. And two, probably more importantly, did you get bored anywhere? Right? Because I don't want anybody to get bored. And my typical rule is if I hear something once, if I hear one piece of feedback, I kind of go, I bounce it off my own internal editor. I think about it. If I hear the same thing twice, I absolutely change whatever it is, because I just assume I'm wrong, basically. But then next step from there is I send it to my agent, actually. My agent is really going to be the first professional set of eyes on it. And I have done whole rewrites based on what my agent has told me. She's a very, very savvy reader, and she also, knows what's going to work in the marketplace and what's not, and what's going to bother an editor and what's not. So by the time and then, like I said, I've done extensive changes based on that. By the time I'm actually sending it to my quote editor in New York, it's actually a pretty close to finished product. And believe it or not, that's really the expectation. There's a saying that editors in New York don't have time to edit. And it's really true. I mean, they're essentially kind of project managers. I mean, you will get some feedback from them, but they are not going to, take some big sloppy mess of a manuscript and hold your hand while you rewrite it for the most part. That's just, they don't have time to do that. A lot of them have, however many authors they have, 20, 25, 30, I don't even know how many authors they will have. And they can only dedicate so much time and attention to each one. So they're really kind of expecting you to have done the work ahead of time. But they will then, like I said, give you kind of what's called an edit letter, and which is generally 2 to 4 pages, something like that, and then you make changes based on that. And then from then on, it's really all about typos and copy editing and whatnot. So you have another phase of editing that is copy edits. They have a professional copy editor who goes through the whole thing and puts apostrophes in the place where they need to be. And then you do the thing called first pass pages, which is the entire book gets printed out exactly like it's going to look in book form, except on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. And everybody goes through it, with their pencil and tries to find typos. Inevitably, we still miss, right? So you will, yes, sometimes buy a book and you'll be like, look at this typo on page 237. Does anybody read this thing? And all of us who are involved in this, who have read it exhaustively multiple times, just kind of, face palm and go, yeah, we read it. We missed it. We're human. So at least know that when you do see that typo, it is a wily little typo that has somehow eluded many, many professional eyes and somehow found its way into your book. But I hope that answers more than enough of your question about editing.
So, Brad, I want to ask the comparative question about the two forms of novels you've been writing. So you're at a point where about half of your novel was a series, half of your novels in a series, and then you've done a series of standalone. And so I guess my question is, what do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of the two approaches? Right. Do you imagine that you'd ever repeat one of the characters that you've had in a standalone to become a series, or are you permanently committed to one-offs, as you will.
So I'm certainly open to either, frankly. And some of this stuff really gets determined, and I hate to sound totally mercenary about it, but it gets determined by the marketplace. For example, like if this book ends up getting made as a streaming series on Netflix, and suddenly there's millions of people downloading it, you can better believe there will be another book with these characters, right? Uh, Beyond that, it's interesting how that pendulum has swung back and forth in publishing, where there have been times in publishing where everybody seems to want series, and there are other times where everybody seems to want standalones. Generally speaking, the more uncertain times are, the more they want standalones, right? They want one book to kind of hit it or not, and then move on. And they don't, because a series for any publishing company it's a multi-book, they hope, investment, right? And there have been times like, probably the one we're going through right now, where like, gosh, nobody knows what next year is going to look like, or 2 years from now is going to look like. So they're not really maybe all that excited about like starting a new series. Now, from a writing standpoint, I have enjoyed both aspects of both equally. When I will hope, by the way, to write Carter Ross again someday. Like if I can get back to that, I certainly will. There's that familiarity, right? There's that comfort, the world, and you get to go maybe deeper into the characters over the course of 5-6 books, whatever it is, than you do in just one book. The flip side of that, though, is in the standalones, the one thing I like is that no one's safe. Right. Like, so in my series book, I'm probably not going to kill off Carter Ross, the protagonist, because one, I would get, my inbox would be stuffed full with people just absolutely livid at me. And two, I have children to send to college someday. So why would I want to, kill my leading character? But that does lead to, again, that feeling of like, well, he's probably not going to kill Carter, and he's probably not going to kill Tina Thompson, Carter's love interest. And so there are some people who are kind of untouchable, for lack of a better word, versus in a standalone, hey man, fair game. Anything goes. And you as a reader don't get that safety of knowing necessarily that so-and-so is going to make it to the end of the book. And I do kind of enjoy that aspect of it quite a bit.
Thank you. I think we have time maybe for one more question. Is there someone who'd like to unmute and address the question?
So I think, bye, Barbara. Besida, I don't know. Besida asked, might there be a possibility of a series of books based on Middlesex County? And yes, Besida, that is clearly, so you'll be interested to note, though, I might not do specifically Middlesex County, because I do like to have some plausible deniability, right? So like in this book, I had the character live in Gloucester instead, and in this book, I made the ultimate scene happen in Whitestone, so I move it to Lancaster County, something like that. So I always I do like to move it around, but yeah, I mean this is a fascinating area, and if nothing else, the Middle Peninsula is great because there are a lot of places around here to hide bodies.
Interesting. Well, thank you. On behalf of the Middlesex County Museum and Historical Society, I want to thank you for sharing time with us. And I want to just a brief announcement. The upcoming events, the next 2 upcoming events of the Museum and Historical Society is on October 16th from 1 to 3. We will have a reception at the historic Rosekill property and present our annual Preservation Award, and you can see information about that on our website. And on November 20th at 4 p.m. we'll have a Zoom in which Meg Hughes will talk to us about how to preserve photographs and historical documents. I want to thank you all for coming and urge you, if you haven't done so, to join the Middlesex County Museum and Historical Society and to participate in future events. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I will try to make sure my character stays on the up and up.